before I get too far into it, in case I forget, let's quickly get a thank you out of the way to Rami and Lynn and all the other people who have been involved in getting this event ready to go. It takes a lot of work and enthusiasm and effort to get these things organised and sorted. So thank you very much indeed. Okay, so
you're welcome, Paul. I just started the recording. Sorry, I couldn't get there on time, but I'm just setting all the screens. All the best.
Cheers, Rabbi. Okay, yeah, so building supportable Canvas apps. So I've been working at Datacom for 3 and a bit odd years now, and a lot of that time has been working with Powerapps. And as well as building my own Powerapps, I've had to take on support for other Powerapps, and some of those have been easier to support than others. So I thought what I would do is put together a little presentation of what I think, and these are just my thoughts and opinions based on my experience, nothing set in stone, but I thought I'd do a little talk on what I think makes an app easier to support and some things that you might want to keep in mind when you're building your apps. Because I think these are going to make life easier for you, both as you're building the app and then as you come to support it, the future you in 6 months who may have forgotten about some of the fine details of the app. And it's also going to help anybody else who has got to support the app in future. Because let's remember that apps, even when someone says, oh yeah, we just need a quick app, it's only going to last 6 months. Yeah, let's see if we can get some audience participation going. Who has had someone come to them and say, we need an app and it's only going to be needed for 6 months? So type a quick yes or no in the chat if you can. I'm trying to keep an eye on it. Yeah, go. Now, how many times has that app actually been finished with after 6 months or after whatever the cutoff date was? Well, in my experience, at least, it's very, very rarely. Apps tend to have a longer lifespan than expected. And the longer an app lasts, the more likely it is that someone else is going to have to take on support for it. Because, you know, the original creator of the app, they may have moved on to another job, another company, may have retired, may have won the lottery, you know, all good things. But yeah, eventually at some point, probably someone else is going to have to take on that app as well. And hopefully that person, if they can, will thank you if you build the app in such a way that it's reasonably supportable. So let's jump in. What I'm going to do is I am going to actually run through an app that was put together quite some time ago, and it was one of these apps which was an internal app that was only going to be used for 6 months. So it doesn't follow all of the sort of best practices that I'm talking about. So it will give me a chance to sort of point things out and pick things out. What you might want to do is to, if you've got multiple monitors, open up one of your own apps if you're feeling daring, and have a look for any of these red flags and little tips that I'm going to run through. And then if you're very honest, you can let us know in the chat, yeah, whether your apps are perfect or whether they whether they have some of these things that maybe we could do better. So let me move my screen over. Oh, that's not the wrong screen. It's jumped to LinkedIn for some reason. Sorry. Let me. Here we are. This is the screen that I want. Here we are. So here's an app, and so if I'm taking on support for an app, I will look for certain things initially. So one of the first things that I'm going to look for is, are there any errors in the app checker straight away? So that's an immediate kind of red flag. If there's already something going on in there, it's not a very good sign. So it's a good idea to try and make sure that all of your app checks, you know, at least the red ones, make sure that all of those are clear before you're going to put your app into production or pass on the support for your app. Otherwise, whoever's going to be looking at that in the future is going to be saying to themselves, well, were these errors here when the app was published, or are these errors that I'm seeing now because perhaps there's changes in the data source or something else? So just make sure that you've cleared all of the checks on there. There is at least one exception to that I'm aware of, which is if you are using the load data and save data commands, which you often have to if you want an app that's got some offline capabilities that can remember its state between sessions. Those commands only work in the mobile players, And of course, you can only work with Studio in your web browser, so you always get a little red mark in there if you're using the load data and save data commands. So that's sort of an acceptable exception, if you like. It's something we can't do anything about. But otherwise, I would say make sure that those are clear. Okay, the next thing I want to have a look at, and you can accuse me of being a bit OCD on this, but is the naming of controls. I have a real bugbear on this. Naming controls is really useful. I know it's really tedious, and often we're in a hurry, and maybe we don't want to name everything, but I maintain that everything in the app, every control should be named. Why should we name our controls in the app? Well, if we're referencing those controls, it's going to make those formulas an awful lot easier to read. So if I've got, let's say, a label on the screen and it says something like, okay, what we're doing is we're taking the value from text box 27 and we're multiplying it with the value by text box 35. When I look at that formula, it doesn't mean anything to me. But if I've made the effort to name those controls, and so I can see, oh yeah, what I'm doing is I am taking the value from control txt product price, and I'm multiplying it by txt order quantity. Oh yeah, that makes sense. I've got an idea straight away of what that formula is supposed to be doing. And if I've accidentally, or someone has accidentally put the wrong control references in, so that you've got a label, let's say, that's called price or total price, line price, and what you've actually done is you've multiplied the product weight by the line quantity. Well, that's pretty obvious straight away. So it makes formulas much easier to read, and it makes it much easier to pick out errors straight away. It also makes your formulas easier to write if you've got a good naming convention, so that when you're typing into your formula bar, you don't have to keep stopping and clicking on things to find out what the name of the item is, and then going back to whatever you were working on before and putting the name in. If you've got a good naming convention, then, as you want to put things in, you can often just continue typing, because the IntelliSense will help you out once you've put in the first few characters. So we can see here there's a bit of a naming convention going on. So we've got things like BTN for button and LBL for label. So we get an idea of what the control is, and then an idea of what the control is doing, what it's for, from the name that is on there. So taking an initial look through here, we seem to have quite a few of our controls named. So it doesn't seem to be too bad. But as we come down a bit further, we can see these are evidence of where there's been some copying and pasting going on of control. So these controls are probably not what they say they are. So that's going to be problematic if anything references those controls. It's also going to be problematic if we're trying to find certain controls. So in actual fact, this app didn't actually require very much support, but I did get a call about it, and that call was saying, okay, there's an export view functionality, and the export view functionality unfortunately isn't working. So the natural thing to do is to say, oh yeah, let's look for something called export view, and we find that there isn't anything called export view or any variation of that, because that control was not properly named. And so I'm not terribly familiar with the app. I've then got to start hunting through different screens and then trying to find where the button may be. And the other issue that we're going to have with that is that it might actually appear in multiple places. And if we're having to sort of go through the app and look by eye to try and find the button, then it's not great. We might be missing the fact that there are multiple instances of it. So naming your controls, really useful for making sure your formulas are working correctly, really useful for making it quicker to type your formulas in, and really handy for trying to be able to find controls if you've had a report about some sort of error and you're not all that familiar with the app and navigating your way around the app. Another place where it comes in pretty useful is, I think I started it off, no, the window's closed. If you use Monitor to try to see what's going on within your app, Quick type into the chat. Does anybody here use Monitor to see what's happening with their app? I'm just going to click through a few screens so that the Monitor window starts to populate with things. So here we go. We've got a list of the controls that have triggered some sort of action within the app. And we can see here a lot of these controls are not named. So it's really difficult for me to know what's actually going on in the app when I just look at this Monitor window. If the controls are not well named, you know, I don't know what Gallery 2 does. I don't know what Gallery 2 is supposed to show. So if that were named, I would have a much better idea of what was happening within the app. So as I say, I think every control should be named. We should be in that habit of naming everything as we're building the app itself. A couple of little tips on naming those controls. Something I didn't realize for a very long time, but you can actually press the F2 key on the keyboard and that will go straight into rename. So if you're having to rename a whole load of controls, it's a real pain to have to keep, you know, doing that and rename and then the next one and rename. So the F2 key means you can just, you know, use your keyboard up and down arrows and the F2 key to work through the controls and name them. And sometimes if I'm taking over support for an app, and particularly if I'm going to be asked to extend that app and do additional work with it, I will actually go through, it takes a while, but I will actually go through every single control and make sure that the controls are named. It's boring and it takes a long time, but for me, it has paid dividends and saved me a lot of time in the long run because I end up with a much better understanding of the app and it's much quicker for me to work with it, particularly when a support call comes through and it's something urgent. You know, if you can then very quickly find the thing that you want, that is going to relieve a lot of the stress of having people breathing down your neck saying, when are you going to get this app fixed? Okay, so that's naming controls. Another thing that I like to see on an app is a version number. So how many of you put version numbers on your apps? I think it's great to put version numbers on. Unfortunately, it's something that's not sort of built into Powerapps, so we're just having to manually update this each time we go in and make a set of changes. But it can be very useful because there could be multiple versions of your app that users have access to. So some users might have access to sort of a preview version or a UAT type version, as well as the current version that most people are using. And it's good to be able to differentiate. Also, there is many a time where I have made changes to an app and I've updated the version number and I've hit save, and then I've said to the users, yeah, that's all done. You can go in now and that bug is fixed or that new feature is available. And everyone is saying, well, I can't see it. And that's when you realize you haven't pushed the publish button. But if you can say to people, okay, yeah, I've made the change, it's in version 2.23, then hopefully they'll come back and say, oh, hang on a minute, I'm still seeing 2.22. So version number's good for that, and really good if you've got people who are using your app on the mobile players who are not necessarily in Wi-Fi range very often. So you can use your Power App on mobile using the cellular data connection, but it won't actually update new versions of the app automatically. And we found in some scenarios like that, you know, you've got some people who are working on very old versions of the app because they've just never had that new version pushed down to them because they're not in the habit of connecting that device via Wi-Fi and then starting the app up and getting the new version. So version numbers are another thing that I look for in the apps. Okay, next one is variables. So in much the same way as your control names, if you have sensibly named variable names, it makes things much easier to understand in your app. I've come across some real good ones. I've come across a variable just called number. So great, that's handy. That tells me lots about what that's for. Another one was called the green button. And my personal favourite, a variable that was simply called Skippy. I never did find out why it was called Skippy. It was just called Skippy. So yeah, doesn't tell you very much. So giving your variables sensible names is a good idea. It will really help the next person understand what's going on in the app and figure out what's happening. So looking through this app, the variable names are not too bad. We've got some slightly different naming conventions going on. I think probably this app was started and then we started discussing naming conventions, and some of the variables got, or new variables got the new convention and old ones were left as they were. So some of these are starting with var for variable. And, you know, most of these I think are fairly reasonable. Not very happy with this one, var selected ID. The selected ID for what? The ID of the product, the ID of the customer, the ID of the order. What's it the selected ID for? So a descriptive name, I think, can really help. The reason for putting var in front of these ones is that there are different kinds of variables in Powerapp, variables with different scope. So these are all under the global list. These are global variables. And a global variable, you can check the value and you can change the value anywhere within the app. And generally speaking, I think you should try to avoid global variables where you can. So if you don't need the variable to be available throughout the whole app, then don't make it global, because it causes confusion. So we might be setting my office city, let's say, or my region in multiple places in the app. And if we're not careful about how we navigate through, then perhaps that's sort of set to the wrong value when we go through a particular screen. So if I come into an app and I see lots and lots of global variables, and quite a few here really, if I see lots of global variables, that's kind of a red flag to me that maybe this isn't put together quite as neatly as it could be. And maybe I'm going to have some trouble with this app because variables are being set in one place and then they're being used in another place, and they're not expecting it to have been set on a particular screen. So the other kind of variable is a context variable. So global variables are created with the set command, and the context variables are created with the update context command. And context variables can only be referenced on that screen. So if you only need to use the variable on that screen, then make it a context variable. It will save confusion. You won't get things mixed up. You can pass variables into screens when you're using the navigate command. Not sure if I've got an example of that here. Let's have a quick look at one of these. But the navigate command has a third parameter, which people often don't realize. So we've got our initial parameter, which is what screen do you want to open, what screen transition do you want to use, what animation do you want to use, and then you can put in a series of context variables. So you can pass values from one screen to the next when you're using a context variable, but you can't use it in other places. So you can use it in the navigate command and you can use it in the specific screen, but you can't use it anywhere else. And that tends to keep things much cleaner and tidier and easy to understand, and less variables getting set to one value in one place and then that value being used when it shouldn't have been in another screen. There is another level of variable, which is with. So there is a function called with. Let me just give myself some space here. So you can use the instruction with, and then you can set up some variables that you want to use just within that formula. So we could say something like with, remember the syntax, pi 3.147 or whatever. And then we can use that, to say, okay, what I need is 5 times. And so you can use that variable only until you get to the closing bracket for the statement. So it's a very, very localized variable. With those, I tend to put a W in front just so I know, okay, yeah, that's part of this with block. It's got a very, very narrow scope. So try and use the narrowest scope that you can for your variables to reduce any confusion. Another little thing to look for with apps, or that I like to look for, is when we come into the app checker, if you've got variables which are not used, so you're creating the variable, you're assigning a value to it, but you never use that value anywhere, then that will show up, I think, under the performance list. And there they are. So we've got a list here, unused variables. So this particular app has 32 unused variables. So yeah, that's a little bit of a red flag to me. This app may have been chopped and changed at some point in the past, and it may have been done in a bit of a hurry, and there wasn't a cleanup done on the variables that were no longer necessary. So when you see this with the unused variables, you can then go in, find out what the variable is, and then you could go and find where that is in the app and then remove the set statement that's setting that variable up. So these ones that say app against them have been created with the set command, they're global variables, and these other ones have been done with the update context command. Okay, is anybody following along with their own app? Does anybody want to comment on whether they've got unused variables? No one wants to hold their hand up. Fair enough, I will carry on. Collections are kind of a special type of variable. A collection is for tabular data. And again, we can see here, this is pretty good on the whole. So col as being the prefix for a collection. So if I see this in a formula and I see col, oh yeah, okay, that's a collection. I know what that is. I know what I'm working with. A limitation of the Powerapps Studio, at least a current one, I think this is on the list of things to be addressed, is that you can't find where collections are being used. So you can find that for variables. If I jump back to variables for a moment, if I want to see, for example, where this global variable is being used, okay, I can see where it's being defined, and if it is being used, that might be one of the ones that wasn't. But if it is being used, then you can find where it's being used as well. But you can't do that for the collections. Collections don't give you any indication of where the collection is being set up and where it's being used. An advantage of collections, because you can actually put tabular data into a normal variable, into a global variable or a context variable. You can set those to tabular data. They will accept that. The advantage of the collection is that you can do things like patches and updates and removes. But if you need some tabular data stored in a variable, but it's going to be static, you know, maybe it's a list of who the administrators of the app are, something like that, and it gets set once as the app opens, and then you're never going to update it while the app is running, then you might want to consider just using a set variable for that rather than using a collection, just because of this limitation of the Studio interface, where it doesn't let you easily find where collections are being used. I've had apps where I've spent a long time trying to find all the places where collections are being created and modified. Okay. Yeah, so I think that's everything I have to say on variables and collections. The next thing then is a personal bugbear of mine, which is invisible controls, or controls which are conditionally visible. Sometimes you see them, sometimes you don't. In Powerapps, of course, we have this sort of nice interactive canvas. So as we're working and building the app, we can go ahead and we can click on things and it'll take us through to the other screens, and then we can make our selections and so on. And so it's interactive. But the problem with it being interactive, in my view, is that if there are controls that are invisible, you know, given the current selection that you've made, then you never see them. You don't know they're there. And if you're not very familiar with the app, that can be really awkward. So a number of problems with that is, someone may send you a support ticket saying, oh yeah, it's the let's say the delivery date field that I'm having a problem with. Well, if I remember rightly, you only get the delivery date field if you've made certain choices within the app beforehand. And so I'm not very familiar with the app. I might be going through here and saying, well, where the heck is this delivery date field? And if you combine that with a lack of naming of the controls, then it becomes very difficult to find stuff. So I'm not a fan at all of invisible controls. Make life very difficult. The other thing they tend to do, I wonder how many we've got on here. A second. Okay, yeah. So I'll tell you what I did there in a second. But the other thing that tends to happen is you can't see the control and you're trying to pick one thing up. So let's say I'm trying to pick up this sort of blue header bar at the top, and I might accidentally pick up the control, this other control, the invisible control, and move it rather than the control that I was aiming for. So it's very easy to move the invisible controls by accident. If you're working sort of quick and you're saying, oh yeah, I just wanted to delete this blue bar in the background. If I were to click and hit delete, if I wasn't really watching very closely what I was doing and I hit delete, well, I've deleted the wrong thing in that case. So I find invisible controls very, very problematic, very difficult to get along with. Why might you make a control which is never visible at all? Well, it might be holding some sort of value that you want to use for later on, or it might be something that you're using for debugging so you can see what values are. My personal solution to those circumstances is just make the thing visible and then change its X property. So we can just say, look, give me the parent width and sorry, I can't type, parent width and add 10 to it. And now that will appear over in the sort of margin of the app. So the user is not going to see it, but I'm not accidentally going to click on that and delete it, move it, do anything else. So putting stuff in the margin, to my mind, is preferable than having controls that are completely invisible. The downside of that, of course, is once you've done that, you can't click on it to actually select it again. So the other thing to do is to make sure that you have made it the topmost item. So I would tend to do reorder and bring to front and then stick it in the margin so that I know all my reference bits of information are at the top of the list of the screen, and also change the name of it to actually say this is reference ref. This is a bit of reference information. This is not something which is actually displayed to the user. Okay, so if I do a Control A on this screen, I'm going to see that there is actually an awful lot of invisible controls on there. So as far as I know, that's the only good way of sort of figuring out where invisible controls are and getting an idea of them. So yeah, I would be worried if somebody said to me, oh yeah, I want you to take on support for this app, because there's obviously a lot of things that appear in certain circumstances. So these are probably going to be things like sort of selection boxes and dialogues that say, do you really want to delete this item, or do you really want to go ahead and add that value? One of the things with Powerapps is, because it's sort of predominantly being developed, I think, with mobile in mind, there's no support for dialog boxes and pop-up boxes and all the rest of it. The only way that you can implement those is to have these invisible controls and then turn their visible property on and off. So I would argue that if the great and the good at Microsoft have decided that dialog boxes are not the way to go, then don't try to buck that trend. Don't try and create your own with this turning things on and off with their visibility. Just have a separate screen for it. So if I want a warning if I'm going to delete something, I can have a delete button on this screen, And when I hit the delete button, why not just have another screen appear that says, do you really want to delete, yes or no? And then that screen, if you say yes, will go ahead and perform the action of doing the deletion. So yeah, real bugbear of mine is the invisible controls. The other thing that tends to happen if you've got a screen that has a lot of these sort of dialogues and has a lot of these additional purposes on it is that when you go into your report checker, you will probably start finding that you're getting screens which are marked as having too many controls on the screen. So what's this one? PO new rec. So there it is. Because this screen has sort of many different purposes, we've got more controls existing on that screen, even though they're not all visible at the same time. We've got more controls on that screen than is ideal, and it's warning us you've got 332 controls on there, whereas we recommend that you shouldn't go over 300. And I've seen screens with 900 plus controls on them, because in the worst examples I've seen, I've had apps given to me which, you know, they have a normal screen and then there's a huge white rectangle which is invisible most of the time, which goes over the top, and then there's a whole other screen on top of that. So you've got one screen which is performing multiple actions and multiple purposes, and that's not good. That makes it very hard to maintain, because you don't know how to get to those other sort of screens within screens. So my advice would be to separate that all out. Okay, so probably said enough on invisible controls now. You can tell they kind of bug me. So the next thing I wanted to talk about, let's maybe jump to the PowerPoint presentation for this next bit. Control naming, invisible controls, dry. So there's a concept in development and programming, which is dry, don't repeat yourself. So if you have repeated controls and repeated code, then that gets difficult, because if you change things in one place, you've got to change things in multiple places. So dry is, you'll often see that, if you're looking in sort of best practices for software. The opposite of dry is, of course, wet, which is we enjoy typing or write everything twice. So try to avoid that. Particular examples are things like, imagine you've got an icon, and the icon has got a label, and when you click on those, they perform a particular action. Perhaps they just navigate you to another screen or something, but you've got the code duplicated. You've got the code behind the on select of each of them. Much better to have the code, let's say, behind the icon, and then just use the select command to say select icon, add product or whatever it is. Have that as the select property of the label, so that if you ever change it, you click on the label and you can see straight away, oh yeah, this is just doing whatever the icon does, and then right, I'm going to go to the icon. Okay, that needs to go to a different screen now, or pass a different value, or have a different transition, whatever it is. If you have the code in multiple places, then you've got to remember to change it in multiple places. And if you're not the original author of the app, you're not necessarily going to know all those different places where that might happen. Another area where I think this dry principle comes into play is having multiple similar screens. So quite often we have an add, an edit, and a view screen. And in some cases, I've seen variations where you've also got an add screen, but it's for the administrators, and an add screen for managers, and an add screen for users, and so on and so on. And all these screens look pretty much the same. They have the same layout, they have the same fields, they have the same labels, and so on, all in the same positions. And so once you start getting into this situation where you've got 4, 5, 6 screens all with the same sort of task, if you then need to go in and you need to make a modification, you need to make a bug fix, or as I say, add a new field or something, then you need to do that, on every single screen. And you might have, as I say, 5 or 6 screens. So you've got 5 or 6 times the amount of work. You've got the problem that you might have forgotten one of them, and then you start getting report calls coming in saying, oh yeah, this is not behaving correctly, and then you've got to test it and check it in all these different places as well to try and find the one that you've missed, the one that's not behaving the same. So my advice again is try and stick to that dry principle. Try not to repeat things because they will duplicate work. I know why we do it. It's because we start off and we make, let's say, an ad screen, because that's what makes sense. We need to be able to add some test data into our app while we're building it. And then we think, oh, right, OK, so we're going to need some edit functionality now. It's going to be a little bit complicated if I have to try and make this ad screen also do edits. But it's very quick and easy for me just to do a copy and paste. And then change a few things. So now I've got an edit screen and then another copy and paste and a view. And that's when you get the call that says, but admins should also be able to do X. And you say, well, I'll just make another copy of the screen. Yes, I can see that it's quicker from an initial development point of view, an initial creation point of view, but it is very problematic for maintaining those apps and supporting those apps. Okay. So that is dry. Comments next. So comments, jump into the app for a moment. I wonder if we've got some comments on some of these. Let's just check. We usually find them in things like the on visible property of screens. OK, no examples here, but what you can do, of course, if you're not already aware, to make a comment, you can just go ahead and a couple of forward slashes, and then you can just type a comment about what's coming next. You can also do large comment blocks with marking the beginning and the end of the section with the star and the slash. Comments are really useful. I've seen arguments made that you shouldn't need to comment code because the code should be simple enough and the variable should be named well enough that it should be possible just to read it. I don't really agree with that, and particularly not in the Powerapps world, where sometimes you get very long blocks of code. You can't sort of break things up into neater little chunks that just perform one task. So while the code might tell you what it does, it doesn't tell you what it's meant to do. So if there's a problem with that code, you don't know what the purpose was necessarily unless there's a comment there. Difficult to figure out how it does it. So just looking at the code may take you quite some time to figure out how it's doing what it's doing. It also won't tell you why the developer, the creator, why the developer chose to do it that particular way. Maybe they tried various other methods, but those methods had problems. If that's not sort of documented anywhere, if there's no comment to let you know that, then you might go ahead and think, yeah, I think I know a better way of doing that, and then changing that code to what you think is a better way, when in fact that's already been tried and problems have been found with that, and that's why the code is working the way that it is. And certainly comments are a lot easier to read and decipher than long, complex formulas that have got many nested sort of if statements and switch statements and patches and so on. That can all get very difficult to sort of try to read and decipher as you're looking for where all of the commas are between the arguments and where the brackets are and so on. Much easier to have a nice, concise little comment somewhere near the top to let you know what it's doing and why it is doing it that way. Okay, I think I'm going to leave it there and open it up for questions. What I've done is, as you can see, I've concentrated on what you can do inside Studio to try and make your apps easier to support. There are, of course, many other aspects, things like documentation and so on. I've not touched on any of that because I wanted this to be sort of a technical session with practical tips about Powerapps Studio itself and what you can do as you're building your apps to put them right. But, keep in mind that there are things outside of the scope of what I've talked about today that are also excellent ideas and excellent practices, but we have to have a cut-off somewhere. So that's where I'm going to stop, and I'm going to invite any questions. Not seeing any questions. I hope people are actually still able to hear me. Lynn, are you there?
Yes, Paul.
Okay. Sorry, Lynn, waking you up. Yeah.
No, just I'm muting.
On my screen, I lost the screen that shows me doing the presentation, so I just had a sudden thought because I hadn't had a lot of feedback whether
yeah, there are some questions.
Cut off mid feed, but I can see now that there's still 20 odd on the call, so that's good. Well, yeah, I hope that was all useful. As I say, it's not stuff set in stone. These are my thoughts. These are my ideas. So you're more than welcome to disagree with me.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Yeah, I already got feedback from Eliza and Richard about how to do like themes so that it's maintainable in future. So I'm just like how you do it, because you have been doing a lot of Powerapps, right?
Yeah, so I don't think this particular app has got it in, but what we did is we created a screen which basically just had, maybe if I start putting one in now, basically just had every type of control you can have. So we had, for example, a button here, and then we have a second button, and then for this button, we say, okay, I want to set, for example, the fill of this button to be whatever the fill of this button here is. So we would call this button the master. So if we call this, oopsie, TN master, we would do things like say, okay, the fill of this button is TN master dot fill. And you do that for all of the properties. It's very tedious, so we only did it the once, and then we copy that from app to app. And then anywhere where you want to put a button in your app, you come back to this screen rather than go up to the insert menu, and you say, right, I'm going to copy this button, I'm going to put it over here, and I might have, obviously many buttons throughout my app, and then I come back to this one because I've had feedback and it says, no, our corporate color is not blue. Our corporate color is something else. Let's say we've changed our corporate color to orange, and now all those buttons are going to change. So yeah, that's how I go about the theming. So we have a theming sheet with one of each control, and then a copy of that which just points to all the properties of that control, and then copy and paste these onto the relevant pages within your app. It does mean that you get a huge number of these
unused controls.
Well, you've got unused controls, and the other thing is you get this inefficient delay loading message, because it's saying, everywhere in your app, because these are going to be on different screens, when that screen loads, it's got to make sure that your theming screen is loaded as well, so that it can see what this is set to. Okay. And so it messes up with that inefficient loading warning, but I don't think that's really a problem, because you're talking about loading one screen. All of your master controls are on one screen, so you're just loading that one screen. It's not like you're loading dozens of screens because of your inefficient references. It's just one screen. You just have to put up with the fact that in this inefficient delay loading, you may see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of number in there, because every button you've got is referencing back to the button here. So it's a little bit of a trade-off, but for the time that it saves, in terms of making sure that initially your app is consistent, and in the time that it saves, if you're told, oh yeah, we're changing the corporate colors, now everything that was blue needs to be orange, the amount that it saves in time and hassle, I think it's a concession worth making, to have that inefficient delay loading warning come up a few times. I'm not bothered about that. Did that differ much from what others have told you in how they do their theming?
I also do it, but again, like I kind of find it kind of clunky way to do it. So I was just thinking like, it is there a better way to do it for now? But then Liza told me there's something coming up next year for theme and color handling. So
yes,
hopefully it's better than this.
I think so. Until that comes up, then this is the method that that I would stick to, because we did once have quite a difficult customer, or let's not say difficult customers, a very particular customer who was really, all the lines, can you make them 3 pixels rather than 2 pixels, those separating lines, and the buttons, can we just change the edge to not quite so straight and just a little bit more curved? So they were folk from a design company, and all the focus was on that. And that was before we'd really started doing the theming sheets, and it just took so long to go through the app each time and make sure that everything was modified in a consistent way that, we just said, not doing that again. Let's, do the theming sheets. Yes, you're quite right. They're clunky to put together. But then if you do have to change anything, you just think, wow, I'm so glad I put that in. I don't have to change all those 500, whatever it is, buttons individually by hand. Thank you very much for the question. Anybody else with a question? I think we need to sort of finish at about 10:55 because we've got to give the next speaker, a chance to test out their mic and their camera and make sure that everything is working. But we've got 2 minutes, so I'm happy to take another question. Okay, nothing at the moment then. Okay then, Lynn, thank you very much for moderating. I shall jump off the call and give the next person a chance to jump in. But I'll be sort of around on this channel for a little while. So if you do have questions that you suddenly think of, then please let me know. Okay,
that was a great session, Paul.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks for taking your time and
difficult
presenting.
When I'm just talking into the mic and the camera to gauge the feedback. So thank you very much indeed for the feedback there. I hope that was useful. And
it was great. And a lot of comments like, they're really awesome. It's a great session, and a lot of people give her clapping feedback. So.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much, folks. And as I say, these are my ideas. It's nothing set in stone. So if you want to, take them, tweak them, modify them, ignore them completely, that's up to you. But hopefully, at least it gets everybody having a little think about, what happens with their apps in the longer term when someone else has got to start taking over and doing that maintenance for them. So awesome. Enjoy the rest of the conference, and thank you very much for being here.
Okay. Thank you, Paul.
Okay. Cheers.